would you like to introduce, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I do have a seconder in Peter Clark's absence. Councillor Marriott, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members, this motion seeks to bring to your attention the provisions of the Elections Act 2022, requiring a new requirement for voter ID. Waverley Borough, like all districts and boroughs, are the local electoral authority responsible for the successful and lawful delivery of elections in our jurisdiction. The Act legislates a requirement for voters to show a valid form of photo ID at the polling station when they vote. I have several concerns expressed in this motion and shared by councils and council leaders across the UK, and more recently the Local Government Association more widely, as for the need for voter ID, the justifications for its introduction, the funding and implementation of the requirements, and most importantly, the communication to residents and its impact. I have supplied in the motion some background information for members as to the instances of local and national in-person electoral fraud. As you can see, the numbers of allegations are low. The numbers of actual prosecutions are even lower, often in single digits. An area where there is great potential for fraud is postal votes, which are actually not addressed by the Act. Mr. Mayor, 3.5 million people in this country do not possess a form of photo ID. We have local elections in May. We are also being told by bodies such as the Home Office and the DVLA, the two entities responsible for issuing the most common forms of photo ID, that there are severe backlogs. We have no formal rules or guidelines for the implementation of this policy from government. And by the time we do, it could well be too late for many to apply for and receive identification at all. Now, the list of valid ID is also slightly curious, and I've submitted the copy that the Electoral Reform Society has put up on their website. Now, young people seem only to be able to use the most expensive and official forms of ID. And that's before you get some other slightly strange examples, such as the 18+ Oyster card being invalid, but the over 65 equivalent, which is absolutely the same card, and I put a picture of it in there for reference, is valid. Now, a cynical person might leap to the conclusion that the government is deliberately trying to structurally disenfranchise young people or those that can't afford ID. But if members have alternative reasons that they can think of for such irregularities in that vote, in that ID list, I would be very amenable to hearing them. But let's have a look at some of the more practical issues for Waverley. Now, the cost. It's probable that the borough will be asked to fill this gap in some way in terms of provision of ID, but we've been given no details of how or what that would be and no real idea of the cost. We can be certain we would need to issue some form of physical ID, but we wouldn't know what that looks like, what it needs to be made of, any biometrics that were involved. What we can be certain is, when you add this to the communication requirements, so literature, officers' time, we have a significant potential cost on the horizon in a climate where any cost is of material concern and with no details. So, Mr. Mayor, my motion seeks to do four things. One, it asks us to ask the relevant ministers to elaborate on the need for voter ID at all and about how it will be communicated and funded. Part two is to enlist our local MPs in seeking answers to these questions and asking for their own view and asking for them to help us in figuring out what we're supposed to do. Three, it's to communicate the substance, the issues and the data on this to our electorate. I know there will be many who aren't aware of it, and I know there'll be many that are keen to understand it. And four, to particularly engage with our young people and schools as soon as possible to raise awareness. I actually, when I was 18, didn't have a passport or a driver's license, and actually I would have struggled to vote. Ironically, I could have stood as a councillor without having to show any ID at all, and that's just another part of this that is a little irregular. I'll finish actually now with a quote, hopefully before the 6 minutes runs out, from Councillor James Jameson, who's the leader of the Local Government Association and himself a Conservative councillor. While we accept that voter ID has now been legislated for, electoral administrators and returning officers should be given the appropriate time, resources, clarity and detailed guidance to implement any changes to the electoral process without risking access to the vote. We are concerned that there is insufficient time to do this ahead of the May 23 elections, and for this reason are calling for the introduction of voter ID requirements to be delayed. Mr. Mayor, my motion is, I hope, as apolitical as I can personally be, as I hope many in this room will appreciate, sometimes a struggle for me, I know. The evidence that I've used to try and justify this has been from as neutral sources as I could find. And I am urging you to agree with the Local Government Association and its Conservative chair that there needs to be some rethink, at least about the logistics of how this is done in the first instance. And actually beyond that, a look at the wider issues in the electoral process and if they're really required. Members, I commend these recommendations to you, and I hope they find reason and favour tonight. Thank you.
Councillors, do I have speakers? Okay, Councillor Marriott has seconded. Do you wish to